September 12, 1996. Coleshill Estate, Wiltshire, England. Dr. Malcolm Atkins' trowel scraped against corrugated iron 12 feet below the woodland floor, revealing an entrance that hadn't been opened in 52 years. This cannot be a random shelter. The concealment is too sophisticated, the location too deliberate. The archaeologist cleared away decades of accumulated soil and leaf matter, exposing a structure measuring roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, buried beneath what appeared to be an ordinary English woodland. The corrugated iron roof showed rust patterns consistent with 1940s manufacturing. Inside, the beam of his flashlight revealed wooden bunks, a hand-operated ventilation pump, and, most startlingly, a weapons cache still wrapped in oiled canvas. Thompson submachine guns, plastic explosives in original packaging, silenced pistols of a design Atkin had never encountered in standard British military documentation. And something else, training manuals stamped Auxiliary Units Most Secret, with instructions for assassination techniques, sabotage operations, and guerrilla warfare tactics that read more like murder manuals than military doctrine. This was the 7th such bunker discovered across southern England since the Ministry of Defense had quietly declassified certain Second World War documents earlier that year. Each discovery added pieces to a story the British government had kept hidden for over half a century. Winston Churchill had authorized the creation of a secret stay-behind army. 3,500 ordinary British civilians trained to become assassins, saboteurs, and guerrilla fighters who would emerge from underground bases like this one if Nazi Germany successfully invaded Britain. The auxiliary units represented Britain's darkest contingency plan. While the Home Guard trained publicly in villages and towns across the nation, preparing for conventional defense, these hidden operatives prepared for something far more brutal: a guerrilla war fought on British soil, where the enemy wore Wehrmacht uniforms and the collaborators wore British faces. Their orders were explicit: kill German officers, destroy infrastructure, eliminate anyone who aided the occupation. Their life expectancy after a German invasion was estimated at 2 to 3 weeks maximum, and their existence remained so secret that most members never told their own families what they'd trained to do. The journey to this hidden bunker, and the revelation of Britain's most secret force, had begun 56 years earlier in the desperate summer of 1940. The genesis of Churchill's secret army occurred on June 4, 1940, the day after the last British troops evacuated from Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo had rescued 338,226 Allied soldiers from the French beaches, but the British Expeditionary Force had abandoned virtually all its heavy equipment. Over 2,400 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition. Britain's professional army had escaped, but it had left behind the weapons needed to defend the homeland. Intelligence assessments painted a dire picture. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated in Poland, Norway, and France that German combined arms tactics overwhelmed conventional defenses. The Kriegsmarine was assembling invasion barges in Channel ports. The Luftwaffe commanded numerical superiority in fighters and bombers. If the Germans achieved air superiority and secured the English Channel for even 48 hours, an invasion force could establish beachheads along England's southern coast before the depleted British Army could organize effective resistance. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for less than a month, understood that conventional military doctrine offered no solution. Britain couldn't match German firepower. The RAF would fight for air superiority, but if that battle was lost, England would face occupation. Churchill needed an insurance policy, a force that could operate even after conventional British military units had been defeated or destroyed, making Nazi occupation untenable regardless of German military superiority. On June 15, 1940, Churchill summoned Lieutenant Colonel Colin McVean Gubbins to 10 Downing Street. Gubbins, 44 years old, had served in artillery units during the First World War and subsequently became one of Britain's leading experts in irregular warfare. He had observed guerrilla operations during the Irish War of Independence and written 2 training pamphlets on irregular warfare tactics, The Art of Guerrilla Warfare and Partisan Leader's Handbook. These documents, initially distributed to British forces in small numbers, outlined principles of sabotage, assassination, and resistance operations. Churchill's instructions to Gubbins were unambiguous. Create a clandestine resistance network that would operate behind German lines if the Wehrmacht conquered Britain. These operatives would not wear uniforms. They would not follow conventional military protocols. They would be stay-behind units, civilians who would remain in occupied territory after regular British forces retreated or surrendered, then wage ruthless guerrilla warfare against German occupiers. Gubbins established his headquarters at Coleshill House, a country estate in Wiltshire chosen for its central location and isolation from population centers. Within 2 weeks, recruitment began across England, Scotland, and Wales. The selection criteria were specific and unconventional. Gubbins wanted gamekeepers, poachers, farmers, estate managers, and foresters. Men who possessed intimate knowledge of the British countryside, could move silently through woodlands, shoot accurately, and lived in rural areas where German occupation forces would need to secure supply routes and communication lines. Recruitment was conducted with extraordinary secrecy. Local Home Guard commanders identified candidates based on their skills and reliability, then invited them to special training exercises. Many recruits initially believed they were joining conventional Home Guard units. Only after arriving at Coleshill House or one of the satellite training facilities did they learn the true nature of their mission. The first operational patrols, small units of 6 to 8 men, were formed in July 1940. Each patrol was assigned a specific geographic area, typically 15 to 20 square miles of countryside they already knew intimately. Their mission, in the event of German invasion, go to ground in hidden bunkers called operational bases, wait for German forces to pass through and establish occupation infrastructure, then wage ruthless guerrilla warfare against German occupiers. By August 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, Gubbins had established over 500 operational bases across southern England. Construction crews worked in secret, often at night, burying bunkers in woodlands, farmlands, and coastal areas. Each operational base was stocked with weapons, explosives, medical supplies, and 2 weeks of rations. After those supplies ran out, auxiliary units were expected to resupply through raids on German positions or die trying. The training that transformed British civilians into guerrilla fighters was unlike anything the conventional British military taught. At Coleshill House, instructors taught silent killing techniques, demolition operations, and assassination tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare and every assumption about how civilized nations conducted combat. Throughout the late summer and autumn of 1940, as the RAF fought the Luftwaffe for control of British skies, auxiliary units training intensified across the British countryside. The pattern of preparation revealed a force designed not for conventional defense, but for systematic terror against occupiers. Training at Coleshill House followed a standardized curriculum that each recruit completed over intensive weekend sessions spread across several months. Instructors, many drawn from Britain's intelligence services and special operations units, taught courses that regular British soldiers never received. Silent killing techniques emphasized using the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, a double-edged dagger designed specifically for assassination. Recruits practiced approaching sentries from behind, using specific hand positions to muffle sound, and delivering fatal strikes to the kidney, throat, or heart. Demolition training focused on maximum damage with minimum resources. Instructors demonstrated how to derail trains using minimal amounts of plastic explosive placed at rail joints, how to destroy bridges by targeting support structures rather than attempting to demolish entire spans, how to sabotage vehicles, telephone exchanges, and fuel depots using delayed action fuses that allowed operatives to escape before explosions occurred. Weapons training emphasized equipment most British soldiers had never seen. The Delisle carbine, a bolt-action rifle chambered in .45 ACP with an integrated suppressor, produced no muzzle flash and generated sound barely louder than the bolt mechanism cycling. At 50 meters, the sound was indistinguishable from ambient countryside noise. The Well-Rod pistol, a single-shot suppressed handgun, could kill at close range with sound no louder than a hand clap. Both weapons were designed for assassination missions where silence meant survival. Auxiliary units also received the pencil gun, officially designated Sleeve Gun Mark II, a single-shot assassination weapon disguised as a thick pencil that could fire a .32 caliber round with enough velocity to penetrate steel armor at ranges up to 100 meters. The weapon was designed to be concealed in clothing, drawn without suspicion, fired at close range against high-value targets like German officers, then discarded. The training curriculum included detailed instruction on target selection. Auxiliary units received intelligence briefings identifying priority targets. German officers, collaborator mayors appointed by occupation authorities, telecommunications infrastructure, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and supply convoys. Each patrol developed target lists specific to their operational area, including the names and addresses of local residents intelligence services identified as likely collaborators, people who might provide information to German authorities, serve in occupation police forces, or otherwise aid Nazi control. Perhaps most disturbing, instructors explicitly told recruits that guerrilla operations would provoke German reprisals against British civilians. Wehrmacht doctrine, demonstrated in Poland, Norway, France, and the Soviet Union, prescribed systematic collective punishment for resistance activities. German forces executed civilians in retaliation for attacks on soldiers, burned villages suspected of harboring partisans, and took hostages who would be killed if resistance operations continued. Auxiliary units accepted this reality as the necessary cost of resistance. Their mission wasn't to spare British civilians from occupation hardship.
The operational doctrine of the auxiliary units represented a profound departure from conventional British military thinking, and understanding their true mission requires examining the specific tactical principles that defined guerrilla warfare in occupied territory. In conventional warfare, military forces seek to hold territory, defend positions, and engage enemy forces in direct combat. The auxiliary units were designed to do precisely the opposite. Their doctrine, codified in training manuals distributed to patrol leaders, emphasized what modern military theorists call asymmetric warfare. Operations designed not to defeat an enemy through superior force, but to make occupations so costly and unstable that military conquest becomes strategically meaningless. The first principle of auxiliary units operations was invisibility. After German invasion forces established control of an area, auxiliary units would retreat to their operational bases and wait. The bunkers, concealed beneath woodlands and farmland, were designed to be undetectable even to soldiers conducting systematic searches. Entrances were hidden inside hollow tree stumps, beneath haystacks that could be moved aside, inside rabbit warrens that appeared natural, or under camouflaged trapdoors concealed by forest floor debris. Captain Andrew Croft, who served as an intelligence liaison to auxiliary units in Kent, later described the concealment techniques. "We could stand 5 meters from an operational base entrance and see nothing suspicious. The best bunkers had multiple concealed exits. If German forces discovered one entrance, operatives could escape through alternative routes that emerged hundreds of meters away in completely different terrain features. Inside these bunkers, auxiliary units would remain hidden for days or even weeks after invasion, allowing German forces to establish occupation infrastructure, headquarters, supply depots, communication lines, garrison positions. Only after the Germans believed they had secured the area would auxiliary units emerge. The second principle was target selection, designed for maximum psychological impact. Auxiliary units were explicitly instructed not to engage German combat units directly. Fighting Wehrmacht infantry companies or panzer units would accomplish nothing except revealing resistance force positions. Instead, operations focused on targets that would terrify occupation forces and disrupt German logistics. Assassinating individual German officers in their quarters at night, sabotaging fuel dumps and ammunition storage facilities, destroying vehicles and equipment in motor pools, cutting telephone lines and destroying telegraph exchanges. Lieutenant Peter Fleming, brother of James Bond creator Ian Fleming, served as Chief Intelligence Officer for auxiliary units in southern England. Fleming's operational guidelines, preserved in declassified documents, specified that every German officer should understand that he is a target at all times, even in areas German forces nominally control. The objective is to ensure occupation troops never feel secure, never rest comfortably, and never trust the British population. The third principle, and perhaps most disturbing from a moral perspective, was the explicit targeting of British collaborators. Auxiliary units received intelligence dossiers prepared by MI5, identifying local residents whose security services assessed as likely to cooperate with German occupation authorities. These lists included people with fascist sympathies, individuals with German business connections, local officials whose personalities suggested they might accept positions in occupation administration, and anyone who had expressed defeatist sentiments about Britain's ability to resist Nazi Germany. Geoffrey Bradford, a gamekeeper from Hampshire who served in auxiliary units from 1940 to 1944, was interviewed in 1998 at age 82. He described receiving his patrol's target list. "We were given a document with 12 names. People I'd known my entire life. The butcher in our village was on that list because he'd made comments that Britain should negotiate peace with Hitler. Our instructions were explicit. If German forces occupied Hampshire, these 12 people would be killed within the first week of guerrilla operations. Not arrested, not interrogated, killed, because they represented the infrastructure through which Germans would establish administrative control." This policy reflected brutal pragmatism about resistance warfare. Successful occupation requires collaboration from local populations. German forces couldn't administer British territory without British citizens willing to serve as mayors, police officers, administrators, and informants. By eliminating potential collaborators immediately after invasion, auxiliary units would deprive German occupation authorities of the local knowledge and administrative capacity needed to govern effectively. The fourth principle was operational security so extreme that auxiliary units never communicated with conventional British military forces, and patrol members often didn't know other patrol locations even in adjacent areas. If captured and interrogated, an auxiliary unit's operative could reveal only his own patrol's bunker location and operations, compartmentalization that prevented German intelligence from rolling up entire resistance networks through the interrogation of individual prisoners. Tom Marks, a forester from Devon who trained with auxiliary units, recalled the psychological weight of this isolation. We understood that if Germans invaded, we'd have no contact with regular British forces, no radio communications, no coordination, no rescue if operations went wrong. We'd operate completely independently until killed or until the Germans were somehow pushed back. The instructors told us frankly that life expectancy after beginning guerrilla operations would be measured in weeks. Most of us would be dead within a month of starting combat operations. We accepted that. The fifth principle was resupply through offensive action. Operational bases contained 2 weeks of rations, ammunition, and explosives. After those supplies were exhausted, auxiliary units were expected to obtain food, weapons, and equipment by raiding German positions. This created a tactical imperative for constant aggressive action. Not raiding meant starvation, so operations had to continue regardless of risk. By 1942, with German invasion of Britain no longer strategically viable following Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union and America's entry into the war, auxiliary units continued training but gradually transitioned toward potential deployment in support of Allied liberation operations if Germany somehow reconquered previous. The operational philosophy behind Churchill's auxiliary units emerged from a specific moment in British strategic thinking. The weeks immediately following Dunkirk, when military planners confronted an uncomfortable truth. Conventional defense of Britain against Nazi invasion was impossible with available forces and equipment. The genesis of auxiliary units doctrine can be traced to a meeting on June 8, 1940, at the War Office in London. Present were Winston Churchill, Chief of the Imperial General Staff Sir John Dill, Minister of Economic Warfare Hugh Dalton, and Lieutenant Colonel Colin Gubbins. The subject under discussion was Britain's strategic position following the French collapse. Intelligence estimates presented at that meeting painted a grim picture. The German Wehrmacht had demonstrated in the French campaign that even well-equipped, numerically superior Allied forces couldn't stop German combined arms tactics. France had fielded more tanks than Germany. The Wehrmacht won through superior coordination and tactical doctrine. Britain's depleted forces, lacking heavy weapons abandoned at Dunkirk, couldn't hope to defeat a German invasion through conventional military operations. The mathematics of defense were brutally simple. Britain's coastline measured over 7,700 miles. German invasion could potentially occur at dozens of landing points, from Cornwall to Scotland. British forces couldn't defend everywhere simultaneously. Once German forces established beachheads and moved inland, overstretched British units would face the same dilemma that destroyed French resistance: trying to fight a mobile war against an enemy with superior armor, artillery, and tactical coordination. Churchill recognized that conventional military strategy offered no solution, but occupation could still be made impossible through unconventional means. The German Wehrmacht was designed to win wars of conquest, not to administer hostile occupied territories where the population actively resisted. If Britain couldn't prevent invasion, it could make successful occupation strategically worthless by ensuring Nazi forces never achieved stable control. This strategic assessment produced specific operational requirements for the auxiliary units. First, resistance forces must survive the initial German invasion and occupation security sweep.
This requirement dictated the construction of hidden operational bases concealed so expertly that German forces wouldn't discover them even during systematic searches. Second, resistance operations must inflict casualties disproportionate to German security measures' ability to prevent them. Small, dispersed units attacking from concealment could kill German personnel and destroy equipment without exposing themselves to German counterattacks. Third, and most importantly, resistance operations must target the infrastructure of occupation administration. Not just German military forces, but also the British collaborators who would enable German forces to govern. This requirement led directly to the most controversial aspect of auxiliary units doctrine, the planned assassination of British civilians identified as potential collaborators. Major Gubbins explained this philosophy in a classified 1941 memorandum. The German occupation authority cannot administer British territory without British administrators who understand local conditions, speak English, and know the population. These collaborators represent the weak point of occupation. Eliminating them immediately upon invasion creates an administrative vacuum German forces cannot fill with their own personnel. The objective is not to kill Germans, it is to make British territory ungovernable. This doctrine reflected a profound philosophical difference between British and German approaches to resistance warfare. When German forces faced partisan resistance in occupied territories like Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, Wehrmacht responses emphasized collective punishment, executing civilians in retaliation for resistance attacks, destroying villages, and taking hostages. German doctrine assumed that sufficiently brutal reprisals would intimidate populations into submission. British strategic planners assessed that German reprisal tactics, while horrifying, were strategically counterproductive. Killing British civilians in retaliation for auxiliary units operations would enrage the British population, making collaboration even less likely and resistance recruitment easier.
Auxiliary units operations were designed to provoke precisely this cycle. Guerrilla attacks would trigger German reprisals, which would intensify British popular resistance, which would require larger German security forces, which would drain resources from other theaters, ultimately making occupation too costly to sustain. This calculation required accepting that British civilians would die in German reprisals. Churchill explicitly acknowledged this in a private memorandum to Gubbins in July 1940. Guerrilla warfare in occupied Britain will result in civilian casualties through German reprisals. These casualties represent the price of resistance and must be accepted as such. The alternative, passive acceptance of Nazi occupation, is strategically and morally unacceptable. The auxiliary units represented the operational expression of this philosophy. They were not designed to win battles, liberate territory, or achieve military victory through force of arms. They were designed to make Nazi occupation unsustainable by ensuring German forces could never achieve stable administrative control, regardless of how many British civilians died in the process. It was a strategic calculation that subordinated individual lives to national survival, a choice that liberal democracies make only in existential crises. While the auxiliary units never fought their intended war, German invasion of Britain never materialized. Examining their operational planning reveals the devastating toll their guerrilla warfare doctrine would have inflicted on both German occupation forces and British civilians. The tactical doctrine developed at Coles Hill House was tested in operational planning exercises conducted throughout 1941 and 1942. These exercises, preserved in declassified War Office documents, provide detailed projections of what auxiliary units operations would have looked like in practice. A January 1942 planning exercise centered on Hampshire examined a hypothetical German invasion scenario. The exercise assumed Wehrmacht forces successfully landed in southern England, defeated British conventional forces in mobile engagements, and established occupation administration across Hampshire within 3 weeks of initial landings. At that point, according to the exercise parameters, 47 auxiliary units patrols in Hampshire would emerge from their operational bases and begin guerrilla operations. The exercise projected that in the first week of operations, auxiliary units would conduct approximately 35 assassination operations targeting German officers and collaborator administrators, 12 sabotage operations against German supply depots and communications infrastructure, and 8 ambushes against German supply convoys. Estimated German casualties: 60 to 80 killed, 40 to 60 wounded, substantial equipment losses. German responses, modeled on Wehrmacht reprisal tactics documented in occupied Poland and France, would include execution of 200 to 300 British civilians taken as hostages, destruction of 3 to 5 villages identified as harboring resistance operatives, and imposition of strict curfews and movement restrictions across the county. The exercise projected that within 2 weeks, Hampshire's civilian population would face severe collective punishment for auxiliary units' operations they had no knowledge of and no ability to prevent. The mathematics of attrition favored the resistance despite these horrifying costs. Each week of operations would kill German personnel, destroy equipment, and require Wehrmacht forces to divert combat troops to security duties. A 1942 intelligence assessment calculated that maintaining occupation security against active guerrilla resistance would require 1 German soldier for every 50 British civilians, a force ratio that would require stationing over 800,000 Wehrmacht troops in Britain purely for security purposes, troops unavailable for combat operations elsewhere. But the human cost would be staggering. The same intelligence assessment projected that after 6 months of auxiliary units operations, British civilian casualties from German reprisals would number between 50,000 and 100,000 dead, with hundreds of thousands more imprisoned or displaced. The auxiliary units themselves would suffer near total casualties. The exercise assumed that fewer than 10% of operatives would survive longer than 3 months of active operations. Captain William Beats, who trained with auxiliary units in Somerset, described the psychological burden of these projections in a 1997 interview. "We understood what guerrilla warfare would cost. The instructors at Coles Hill didn't hide the mathematics from us. They told us that if Germans invaded and we began operations, thousands of British civilians would die in reprisals, probably including our own families. We trained anyway, because the alternative, allowing Hitler to successfully occupy Britain, seemed worse than any number of deaths. That's a choice no one should have to make, but in summer of 1940, it was the choice we faced." The operational planning also revealed the specific targeting priorities that made auxiliary units so morally complex. Each patrol maintained detailed intelligence files on local residents identified as potential collaborators. These files, several of which survived in archives, read like pre-positioned death lists. One such file from an auxiliary unit's patrol in Cambridgeshire contained 23 names with detailed information: home addresses, family members, daily routines, vulnerabilities. The document noted which individuals were likely to accept positions in German occupation administration, who had business connections to Germany, who had expressed defeatist political views. Next to each name was a notation, Priority 1, Priority 2, or Priority 3, indicating the order in which they would be targeted if invasion occurred. Robert Hughes, a farm manager who served in the Cambridgeshire Patrol, recalled the weight of maintaining these lists. "We were being ordered to kill our neighbors, not soldiers, not strangers, people we saw in church every Sunday. The school teacher whose children played with our children. The banker who handled our accounts. The man who sold us livestock feed. These were the people we'd assassinate within days of German invasion because intelligence services believed they'd help Germans administer occupation. Living with that knowledge while maintaining normal peacetime relationships was surreal and psychologically devastating. As the war progressed and German invasion became increasingly unlikely, auxiliary units training evolved. By 1943, some units began training for potential deployment in support of Allied liberation operations if Britain was somehow reoccupied after D-Day failed, a contingency that thankfully never occurred. Other units prepared for possible deployment to liberated European territories where British forces might need experienced guerrilla warfare instructors to support local resistance movements. In November 1944, with Allied victory increasingly certain and German invasion of Britain impossible, the War Office formally disbanded auxiliary units. Members were demobilized and sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. Many returned to their pre-war occupations as gamekeepers, farmers, and foresters. They carried with them knowledge of tactics they'd trained to use against their own neighbors, operations they'd planned in detail, and target lists they'd memorized. And they told no one, not wives, not children, not friends, what they'd been prepared to do. The full scale of Churchill's secret army only became clear decades after the war when British government documents were declassified in the mid-1990s and surviving members finally spoke about their service. Statistical analysis based on War Office records indicates that auxiliary units recruited approximately 3,500 personnel between July 1940 and the program's termination in November 1944. These operatives were organized into approximately 500 patrols, each consisting of 6 to 8 members. Geographic distribution placed the highest concentration of patrols in southern England, Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, Dorset, and Cornwall, where German invasion was most likely to occur. The operational infrastructure constructed to support these patrols was substantial. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Defense of Britain project between 1996 and 2005 identified physical remains of over 400 operational bases, with researchers estimating that 100 to 150 additional bases existed but remain undiscovered due to superior concealment or destruction. Most operational bases followed standardized design specifications. Buried approximately 12 feet underground, measuring 8 to 12 feet in length, constructed from corrugated iron with earthen covering, equipped with hand-operated ventilation systems, wooden bunks for 6 to 8 men, and weapons/storage. Weapons allocation to auxiliary units was extraordinary for supposedly civilian forces. Declassified quartermaster records indicate that auxiliary units received approximately 1,000 Thompson submachine guns, more than many frontline British Army units possessed in 1940. They also received approximately 500 DeLille suppressed carbines, 500 Welrod suppressed pistols, 300 Piat anti-tank weapons, and substantial quantities of plastic explosives, detonators, and delayed action fuses. Training infrastructure included Coleshill House as the primary school, with 12 satellite training locations across England and Scotland. Between 1940 and 1944, instructors conducted approximately 850 weekend training sessions, each accommodating 10 to 15 recruits. Total training expenditures are estimated at £2.5 million in 1940 to 44 pounds, equivalent to approximately $125 million today. The most striking statistic, however, is survival.
100% of auxiliary units personnel survived the war because they never fought their intended mission. Not a single operative died in guerrilla operations against German occupation forces because German invasion never occurred. This represents a profound irony. Britain invested enormous resources preparing for catastrophic guerrilla warfare that would have killed thousands. Yet the successful defense of Britain through conventional air and naval power rendered that preparation unnecessary. For comparison, resistance movements that did fight occupation, the Polish Home Army, French resistance, Yugoslav partisans, Soviet partisan units, suffered casualty rates between 30 to 60%. If auxiliary units had fought as planned, their casualties likely would have matched or exceeded these rates. The 3,500 men who trained to become Britain's stay-behind guerrillas expected to die within weeks of beginning operations. Instead, they returned to peacetime lives carrying secrets they kept for 50 years.
September 12, 1996. Coleshill Estate, Wiltshire, England. Dr. Malcolm Atkin emerged from the concealed operational base into late afternoon sunlight, carrying a Thompson submachine gun still coated in preservation grease applied 52 years earlier. The archaeological discovery provided physical confirmation of what declassified documents had revealed 6 months earlier. Churchill's secret army had existed, had prepared for guerrilla warfare on British soil, and had remained hidden for over half of a century. In the years following 1996, archaeologists discovered auxiliary units bunkers across England, Scotland, and Wales. Some were found in woodland areas that hadn't been disturbed since the 1940s. Others were discovered by farmers whose plows struck corrugated iron roofs buried just below plow depth. Each discovery revealed weapons, equipment, and supplies preserved exactly as they'd been left when auxiliary units disbanded in November 1944. The irony of the auxiliary unit story is profound. Britain's darkest contingency plan, preparing to wage guerrilla warfare that would kill thousands of British civilians in German reprisals, was rendered unnecessary by the RAF's victory in the Battle of Britain and the Royal Navy's continued control of the English Channel. The invasion never came. The guerrilla warfare never happened. The collaborator target lists were never used. The assassination training was never applied. The 3,500 men who accepted what amounted to suicide missions returned to peacetime lives without ever firing shots in anger. Yet, the auxiliary units represented something essential about Britain's determination in 1940. Churchill authorized their creation at Britain's darkest hour, when invasion seemed not just possible but probable. He accepted that guerrilla resistance would cause massive British civilian casualties through German reprisals. He authorized the assassination of British citizens identified as potential collaborators. He approved warfare tactics that violated conventional military ethics and international law. He did all this because allowing Nazi occupation to succeed was strategically and morally unacceptable regardless of the costs resistance would impose. The lesson of the auxiliary units transcends World War II history. It demonstrates that liberal democracies facing existential threats will prepare for actions that peacetime ethics would condemn. It proves that determined resistance movements with local knowledge, popular support, and proper training can make occupation untenable for even militarily superior occupiers. It shows that the principles of asymmetric warfare, hiding among populations, targeting occupation infrastructure, accepting civilian